Okay, well, we are finally at the major controversy of today's lecture that I started the beginning with. I said we were going to talk about something really controversial, and we are finally at that point in the lecture where we're going to talk about the repressed memory controversy. It had major implications for psychology and the legal system, and it also illustrates quite strongly how differences in traditional clinical psychological practice and experimental psychological approaches can really have an impact on how a psychological issue is dealt with in the legal system. So, one of the most well-known cases, still, even it was the late 1980s, early 1990s, the George Franklin case. And this really brought to the forefront many of the issues, controversial controversial issues surrounding the so-called repressed false memory debate. So I gave you a link on slide number 9, and then 2 additional links. The first link is a very brief clip about the George Franklin case, wherein his daughter claimed that she uncovered consciously a previously repressed memory, meaning it was hidden from her consciousness, of her father killing her best 8-year-old friend when she was 8 years old, Susan Nason, with a rock and then attacking her and raping her. She had no memory of this previously, and then claimed 20 years later, an instant that she was experiencing reminded her of this. So I want you to watch that clip, and I also want you to watch the 2 other clips that I've provided here that give you additional background on the repressed memory debate, because then after you watch that, I want to explain some terminology to you. So before you get to those videos, real quick, beginning in the 80s, and really gaining public attention in the 90s, the repressed memory therapy issue really offered sort of a gateway for victims seeking justice when they were abused or otherwise violently harmed or attacked. The problem with this is that there were also many false accusations. And there were cases where a victim supposedly recovered a once hidden or repressed memory that was later not corroborated by additional individuals, such as an abuser or other evidence. There have been a handful of cases where there is corroboration, but the controversy surrounds whether or not we can ever truly forget. We can ever truly hide in an unconscious part of our mind a really painful, difficult experience like being attacked or being harmed. And unfortunately, there were cases in the 80s and 90s and beyond where someone claimed to have recovered a memory of something horrific, and it was later shown to be not only false, but caused by therapy. Where the suggestion of a clinical psychologist or clinician or some type of mental health professional, the suggestion in therapy implanted a false memory that became believable. And unfortunately, in those cases, innocent people were actually prosecuted, and in some cases convicted and incarcerated, only later to be exonerated with DNA evidence or other corroborative evidence showing they could not have been the individuals who carried out the crime in question. In the case of George Franklin, his daughter claimed that she remembered her best friend at 8 years old being attacked and killed by her father. And she had all these details that she claimed to have remembered. And she went to therapy, and then these memories became more graphic, more detailed, and more solidified in terms of her belief that they were real. So if you would take a moment, well, more than a moment, because there's 3 clips, take some time to watch those videos. Once you've watched those videos, then I want you to join me because I want to talk about some extremely important words. Words. What do they mean?
Fantastic countdown.
What do they mean?
It means that we count down the favorite clips from the fans. What does that mean?
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
What does that
I'm a big Impractical Jokers fan, Those are the impractical jokers in the background. What does that mean? Is a good segue. Once you have finished watching those clips on the repressed memory cases and the some of the background on repressed memory and false memory debate, come back to slide number 9 so we can talk about some incredibly important vocabulary that of course denotes concepts that are critical for understanding the false memory debate. Let's start with clinical psychology approaches to memory, in particular repressed memory. The idea is that traumatic experiences create unique memories that differ in kind from non-traumatic memories. And in particular, the idea is that especially when a young person, a child, experiences trauma, let's say sexual abuse, the person at that stage of development is not secure enough in his or her identity to own that memory. And if that person were to own that memory and recognize it consciously as her own experience, then she would be unable to function. So as a protective coping mechanism, clinicians argue that memory gets repressed. In other words, it is placed outside of conscious awareness so the individual can continue to function without thinking about this horrific thing that happened. This comes out of theoretically the psychodynamic perspective, which I mentioned in previous discussions, focuses on early childhood experiences, and this idea that we have an unconscious mind that can harbor some of our experiences without our immediate awareness or our awareness at all. Now, also related to this repressed memory issue is the controversial concept of dissociative or psychogenic amnesia. So you may have heard the term amnesia, right? Amnesia in general means memory loss. We can have organic amnesia, meaning you have trauma to your brain, and that amnesia can be temporary or permanent depending on what's happened to your brain. But dissociative or psychogenic amnesia is controversial because there's nothing wrong with your brain. You haven't had an accident or a tumor or a surgery or anything that could, or a degenerative brain disease that could have altered your memory. In this case, the idea is the amnesia is psychologically influenced. Dissociative, meaning by not remembering the traumatic experience, you can remove yourself from it. Dissociation means we psychologically and emotionally remove ourselves from an experience. So in this case, it's called psychogenic or dissociative because the amnesia is said to be caused solely for psychologically protective purposes. In addition, flashbacks are a very important but controversial concept associated with repressed memory. And you may have heard the term flashbacks if you took my mental illness class or someone else's mental illness class and you know something about post-traumatic stress. Flashbacks are said to be cases in which these memories that have been removed from consciousness, that have been placed outside of our awareness, start to bubble up to the surface, where we have a temporary flash of a memory that we otherwise don't have access to, right? And when these flashbacks happen, we often think we're in the moment of them actually taking place. So for example, people with post-traumatic stress disorder talk about flashback states, where let's say a veteran in combat hears a very loud sound, and that loud sound triggers what's called the flashback. And in that moment, and how long it lasts varies, but in that moment, they are no longer able to process the environment they're currently in. They start to act as if they're back in a combat zone, protecting themselves, because the loud sound reminds them of gunshots or other things firing in the environment. And during the flashback state, the important thing about this, why it's controversial, is during the flashback state, the person is not processing the environment they're in. They're acting as if they're back in the traumatic incident. Another controversial concept. Let's try this again. Another controversial concept associated with the clinical approach to repressed memory is something called conversion disorder. So conversion disorder is a disorder that involves dealing with difficult psychological and emotional content by making it a physical problem. We convert, that's why it's called conversion disorder, we convert psychological and emotional problems into a more tangible physical symptom. So for example, people who have pain, but pain that cannot be attributed to any physical problem, might be converting a repressed traumatic memory that they can't consciously deal with into physical pain. That's something they can deal with. They might have panic attacks, they might have anxiety, they might have depression, but the cause of it is said to be this traumatic incident that they have not been able to consciously recognize or process. And so for clinicians who argue that all of these psychological processes take place when somebody experiences trauma in childhood, especially something like being sexually abused or witnessing violence, then they argue that all of these psychological processes come together. And the only way to, quote, help the person is with psychoanalytic tools, therapeutic psychoanalytic tools, to help them, quote, recover the memory. This is very theory-based, and the controversy is that empirical data, empirical research does not support that memory works this way. In fact, things like flashbulb memories, if you've ever taken a course in cognition or you remember from your intro class, flashbulb memories would suggest the opposite. When we have a flashbulb memory, we have a very detailed memory beyond the norm for an incident we experienced that had special significance. And arguably something like a traumatic incident would be out of the ordinary. So many cognitive psychologists who study memory say, wouldn't we expect people to have more of a flashbulb memory for trauma than repress it and not remember it at all? Clinicians who believe in the psychodynamic approach and believe that trauma is special say no, that in order to protect the child and allow the child to continue to function, the mind has to somehow protect the child from the memory. And the only way to help the person then is to use psychoanalytic tools like hypnosis to help the person recover the memory in a safe, therapeutic environment. Now, another reason that these repressed memory cases are so controversial beyond the lack of empirical data is that they seem to be isolated individual cases with specific therapists who seem to frequently have these cases arise. We're not seeing this across all therapists. There are specific therapists who seem to have these recovered memory cases, and then we have to ask whether or not they are somehow leading their patients to accept that this happened to them when it's really a false memory that's being suggested. Especially since the therapy is being done with a what we call retrospective focus. We're asking people to think back in time. And one of the things that experimental psychologists, cognitive psychologists have decades of research that shows is memory is highly inaccurate and fallible. Retrospective memory means thinking back in time. When we think back in time about most things, we make a lot of mistakes, but we don't know that we're remembering falsely. Now, experimental psychologists, on the other hand, have a very different perspective. Experimental psychologists, cognitive psychologists who study memory function say, look, memory has been, we have decades, literally decades of research showing that memory is malleable. Meaning it's easy to change people's memories with little suggestions and leading questions and presenting them with new information after the fact. And the really frightening thing is that people don't know their memory has been changed. Their confidence level about these memories is still high, even though their memories are wrong. And we have empirical data with controlled studies, like I mentioned, randomly assigning people to experimental control groups. We have empirical data that supports how easy it is to mess people's memories up. And we know post-event information changes memory. Post-event means information you are exposed to after you experience something. So there are scores of data. And we'll see this with our eyewitness testimony unit, where people watch, let's say people watch a video. We'll use the car crash again to stay consistent with what I said on a previous video. People watch a car crash, and then we randomly assign some people to the post-event information group and some people to the control group. And the people in the post-event information group are given misleading information after the video. Then they're asked questions about what they saw in the car crash video. And what these studies show time and time and time and time and time again, it's been replicated so many times, is that when people are assigned to that post-event information misleading group, not group, I can't talk today, that group, on average, they have more memory inaccuracies than people in the control group. And the thing is, they don't know it. They're still highly confident their memory is accurate. Studies show things like guided imagery can really influence people's memories and change them. And the more imagery that they're asked to engage in, the more confident they are that what they think happened really happened, even though it didn't. So there have been some studies where people are assigned to a guided imagery group after they witness an event. And in that guided imagery group, people are told to use all of their senses to try to remember what it smelled like, what it looked like, what it sounded like. And the more people are asked to do that, the more likely it is they will falsely remember things that didn't happen. Now, why does this matter for the repressed memory debate? Because in therapy, many of these cases where people claim to have recovered a repressed memory of abuse or trauma, guided imagery was used in the hypnotic state or the non-hypnotic state as a therapeutic practice to help people to relive the memory, which then makes it more real for them. And we know that guided imagery increases the believability of false memories. And here's something even worse. The combination of source amnesia and confabulation, two really important words. What does that mean? Source amnesia is a very common phenomenon in human beings. It's been shown time and time and time again. What this means is we remember the content of the information we learned, but we don't remember how we got that information. And I'm guilty of this. It happens frequently. Somebody will tell me something, whether it's a joke or something that was posted on social media, and days later, weeks later, sometimes I will tell the person that information and say, oh, you got to hear this joke, or oh, I got to tell you what somebody posted. And sometimes they're the ones who told it to me, or they're the ones who posted it. I did this with my boyfriend recently, and I have an elephant memory. Like, I have a crazy, amazing memory. So this doesn't happen to me very often, but it does happen. And this happens with my boyfriend, where he'll post something on social media that I saw, and then weeks later I'll say, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, you got to see this thing that was posted. And he'll say, I posted that. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So source amnesia is important in this debate, because oftentimes when people are in therapy and guided imagery is being used and other techniques in which their memory is vulnerable, and therapists are leading them to believe something happened, they might later remember the information, but not how it got there. They might not remember that that was something that was discussed for the first time in therapy, not something that happened when they were younger. They lose the ability to discriminate between where that information came from and what really happened. And then they start to accept these memories as real, even though they're not. Confabulation is another phenomenon that memory research have shown time and time and time and time and time again. What this means is that over time, memory naturally decays, meaning we have gaps in our memory, meaning we lose some of the information. And what we do without knowing it, this is the most important thing about this. We don't know we're doing it. We are not aware we're doing it. We fill in the gaps in our memory with things that sound plausible, meaning things that sound like they could have happened, things that make the story flow, but they didn't really happen. And we don't know we're doing it. People do this all the time. So if I ask you to recount an experience when you were a child at a mall with your parents, or at Christmas one year, or whatever you celebrate, chances are you've lost some of the memory, but you will also likely tell me a fluid story. And some of that is confabulation, but you're not aware of it. You're filling things in that make sense. Like, oh, we made cookies and we, you know, and then we sang some songs because that sounds right for a holiday presentation or a holiday celebration. We watched the football game and that might not really have happened, but you don't know that you're adding details that make the story flow, right? So what all of this means and why experimental psychologists are skeptical and concerned about repressed memory and the use of that repressed memory issue in a court, in a legal issue, is because of what is known as iatrogenesis. Complicated sounding word, but not a complicated concept. It means that many of the cases of repressed memory may well have been the product of suggestion in therapy. Iatrogenesis means that the problem the individual in therapy is presenting was created by the therapy itself. It was not there previous to the therapy. And the suggestion here is that vulnerable people in therapy who have a problem they need solved, or they're feeling depressed or anxious, they want a reason for that. And clinicians who strongly believe theoretically in repressed memory may be leading, may be suggesting, may use guided imagery, right? And these things are altering memory and creating a belief in a false memory that never actually occurred. So we have to worry about that. And the researchers who say this have conducted nonpathetic research. They've tested how easy it is with different conditions and different types of circumstances on very large groups of people. And they've replicated it many times, how easy it is to produce the types of memory errors that I'm talking about here. And some folks who believe in repressed memory, some clinicians say, well, those studies aren't about real trauma. To combat that, these memory research have also I really need to learn how to talk. I can't talk today. I'm sorry. These memory researchers have countered that claim that these studies aren't about real trauma by studying people who have experienced trauma, like Holocaust survivors, veterans of war. And what these memory researchers have consistently found is the opposite of what repressed memory suggests. They cannot forget the trauma. They have more of those flashbulb memories. They're hyper-aware and very detailed. They're not repressing it. They're not removing it from awareness. They're not unaware of what happened. They're overly aware of what happened. They are hyper-aware and they have detailed graphic memories. So I want you guys to think about that. I said I was going to do 4 slides in this video, but this actually wound up taking a bit longer than I anticipated. So I'm actually going to end this video here and have a new video for applying some of the cases that have come through the court where repressed memory syndrome versus false memory syndrome and experimental psychologists versus clinical psychologists have butt heads in the legal system. So think about what I said in this video, these different concepts, what they mean, how they work, before you move on to the next video and the legal cases involved. I'll see you soon.